All right, we're going to learn a little bit about the Bernina 1008. This is the machine that we use in the costume shop at Francis Marion University. It is made by Bernina. This particular model is what we call a mechanical machine. Uh, a lot of sewing machines today have electronic components or digital computerized components. This is one that doesn't have any of those elements. The advantage of that is the repairs. You can still use the machine. You don't if the motherboard goes out, you can still use the machine, and you don't have to worry about that component with repairs. It's all just the mechanical stuff. So as long as you keep those gears oiled and keep it serviced and in time, it should last for many, many, many years. The Bernina and the Bernina 1008 you find in a lot of costume shops, at least for now. They believe they have discontinued this model, so we'll be looking into probably electronic or digital or computerized machines soon. But for now, this is what we've got. We're going to go over a lot of the things that the machine does, how to thread it, and then that should hopefully help us as we move forward in our sewing. So the first thing we have to do is, of course, turn the machine on. There's a dial on the side over here. If you turn it once, the machine is on, but the light is not. Twice, and the light comes on. Most sewing machines have a light over here above this is the throat plate, and this is the presser foot. This is your needle. So because this is where we're putting a lot of our attention, this is where we tend to need a lot of light. So some of the dials that we see here, right up here, this is our stitch width. If you see on the side here, this is little zigzag line. Anytime you see that, that's indicating that that's the stitch width on a sewing machine. This one goes from 0 to 5, and essentially what it means is if you have this set on anything other than 0, as your machine is going forward, it's also moving side to side to create a zigzag stitch. You might use that to stitch on appliques, things like that. It's what we use for buttonholes, satin stitches. Mostly it's decorative things as opposed to functional, but you also might use it to finish the edge of a seam if you don't have access to a serger, things like that. Now the center dial, this part that's up and down right here, also if you look to the side, there's a little guide here, and it shows the needle and it shows the dots underneath the needle in different places. This will move the needle from side to side, so you can still stitch straight, but it's off center. So I'm going to turn this dial, and if you'll watch the needle when it happens, we can move that needle to the side or have it in the middle. Most of the time, we're going to have this in the middle. It's very rare that you move it from side to side, so you won't be doing any of that. I just wanted you to understand that function. This dial here is the buttonhole. And this machine has a 6-step buttonhole. When we're doing the vests and we get to that step, we'll show you how to use that because it's a very specific thing and it just does that one function. We're going to really focus on what it does for the overall sewing for now. But this, you'll set your machine up in a certain way with the length and with the stitch length. You won't have to deal with the width. And as you turn the dial, it will adjust the rest of the parts of the machine for you. Speaking of stitch length, we've talked a little bit about stitch length when it comes to construction. The longer your stitch, the more temporary the stitching is because it's just not as tight together and the seam could pull apart. So for this particular machine, we have increments going from 0 to 5. 5 is your longest stitch length. 0 means the needle's not moving at all. This is really about the feed dogs. So the feed dogs, underneath our presser foot here, let me take this off so you can see better. So these little guys right here, these little teeth, they're called feed dogs, and this is what actually moves the fabric through the sewing machine. So if I turn my hand wheel, this is our hand wheel, this is a way to operate the machine without using the foot pedal. This is a way you can go much more slowly and have a little more control. And we always turn the hand wheel toward us. So, but if you watch the feed dogs, see how the action of those? So they come up, they grab the fabric, and then they pull back, and then drop away, and then come forward and grab a new part of the fabric and drop away. So that's what's actually moving the fabric through the machine. So you don't push or pull the fabric through the machine. The machine does that. You're simply guiding it to keep it in line as it's moving. I'll put this presser foot back on. The presser foot has to be engaged in order for the feed dogs to work. There's a lever in the back here that just will raise the presser foot up or down. When you start sewing, the presser foot needs to be down on the fabric in order to have those feed dogs work. Now, the length controls the rate at which the feed dogs move to determine if your stitch is longer or shorter. And the way that we adjust on this machine that number is we turn the center dial to move it up or down from 1 to 5, as it were. And for us, we're gonna sew about 2.5 to 3 is where we'll set our stitches for costume sewing. The other thing that this style does is if we look to the side here, there's this weird little U shape with an arrow. This is for back stitching. So if we just raise this lever up, what's going to happen is normally our fabric's being pulled through this way, so we're stitching along, but if you have this raised up, it's actually going to stitch backwards. It's going to reverse itself. And then you let go and it'll go back to stitching normal. That's how we do the back stitch. So at the beginning and the end of every seam, you need to do a back stitch or a back tack. So that is just a little, like 2 or 3 stitches at the beginning and the end that will secure the seam so it doesn't come unraveled. So that's how we kind of tie a knot with the sewing machine, is with the back stitch. And you need your reverse to do that. All sewing machines are going to have a stitch width, a stitch length, and a reverse. They may not and they might look different on the machines, but they're going to have all those elements. They may not have this buttonhole dial here. Buttonholes are done slightly differently on every machine. The essential steps to a buttonhole are the same, but how the machines are set up to do it might be different. Another thing we have here is this very bottom dial. If you see on one side there's a green line, another side there's a red line. And that references our stitches, which are up here on the top. So there's a set of green stitches and a set of red stitches. And depending on where this dial is, will determine which set of stitches we're accessing. We almost always use the green ones. The red ones are more decorative, and we don't use those as often. To change the stitch on this machine, we slide this lever over and we can move it up or down, if you can see where those little red and green guys are going. So right here at the bottom is our straight stitch and zigzag, which we're going to be using 99% of the time. Occasionally, we may do this stitch here, which is our blind hem, and that's something that we might look at later. But essentially, you just need it to be on this one, which is straight stitch and zigzag. The other thing we have down here is the center dial here. So the outside ridge part is what changes it from red to green. This middle section here, if we look down here, there's a zigzag and straight stitch icon. Over here, we've got like a little grid pattern. What's that telling us is if we're sewing, regular sewing, we want to have it set to the straight stitch and zigzag. If we want to drop our feed dogs and have free motion sewing, then we will turn this here. And what happens then is our machine will be in action, but the feed dogs are not engaged, which means it's not pulling the fabric through. That's when you'll have to manipulate the fabric to go where you need it to. The only application I've ever seen for this is a free motion quilting, where you have multiple layers of fabric and a filler in between, and you can kind of create a design as you want by moving the fabric around yourself. So again, that's not something we're going to do. This is just information about what these dials do and are. What you need to know about all these dials is while we're sewing for this class, you're going to want your stitch width. Most of the time it's going to be on 0. We want our needle in the center. We want our stitch length on 2.5 or 3 for sewing. For basting, gathering, or ease stitching, we want it down on a 5. And there's no back stitching when you do those stitches because they're intended to be temporary. You may sometimes do a back stitch if you're basting something together, but most often, if you're using those longer stitch lengths, you're not back stitching. And then we need to know the reverse. So we shouldn't ever touch the style. We will only need this one if we do buttonholes, and we very rarely, if ever, going to move that center one. So that's the dials that control all the things. I mentioned over here the hand wheel. So this wheel is what will control the action of the machine. And you could do that by hand, but we most of the time will use a foot pedal, kind of like driving a car. The harder more pressure you put on it, the faster it's going to go. So it can get pretty fast, but you can also start and control that pretty well. So now if you look, I took my foot off the pedal and the needle is down in the machine. Well, if I'm going to sew next, then I want that to be clear. So I'll use my hand wheel to turn to complete the stitch. Now my needle is up and it's what looks like its fullest position, but this part here, this is called the looper, and this is part of what helps move the thread through the machine. In order to complete a stitch, so we've sewn, our fabric is under the machine, and before we pull that out, our needle may be up, but we want to make sure our looper is in its topmost position before we pull the fabric away. That's going to save you a lot of headache when you go to sew the next time, because if that's not all the way at the top, your thread may pull out of your needle and then you have to rethread it. So it's not going to break anything, it's not going to ruin anything, but your life will just be a lot easier if you always keep the looper at the top at the end of your stitch before you pull the fabric away. All right, dials, hand wheel. Now we have to know how to thread it, because nothing's going to happen if we don't have thread in the machine. And speaking of threading your machine, 9 times out of